The question is, how does this play out with all this uncertainty, this chaos? People are waking up. They don't know what they're going to wake up to.
This is the way America reinvents itself. The old system becomes obsolete, doesn't work. We kick it over, we build a new one. That's American.
What are your feelings when it comes to the supremacy of the U.S. dollar? Will it hold on to its reign? Or do you feel that we're seeing a system reset here?
There's a great upside to exports. There's a great downside to them too. Wars.
America's cornering itself, and we're seeing all these alliances forming. What does this look like?
If you're in business and you have only one customer, he owns you.
And I'd love to get your analysis of why there's a race to hoard gold by central banks.
Imagine the United States, each of the states having their own foreign policy. So Europe has to do some very hard work reinventing itself.
And if they don't?
And if they don't, this is the place I look for war.
Unstable as things may feel, America isn't collapsing. It's merely going through a predictable and necessary reset. And in 10 years, we'll be fine. This is according to my guest today. He is a renowned geopolitical forecaster. George Friedman has been described as predicting the big picture movement of nations better than most people on the planet. He's also the author of multiple best-selling books, including Storm Before the Calm, and is the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. And he joins me today. George, I am honored to finally have you on the show. Welcome.
I'm very pleased to be here.
Now, obviously, I saw your past interviews, especially the one you just did with Tucker Carlson that went viral, where you warned about a reset. And for the audience watching, it's not the one we associate with the World Economic Forum, but it's a different type of reset, correct?
Right. Well, the United States is the center of gravity of the world at the moment, and has been ever since World War II. The United States has, going back to the founding, a 50-year social and economic cycle. I don't know why it's 50 years, but on the dot. So I was able to predict that in the 2024 election, we would enter the storm. So we
Right.
transit from one period to the next with a storm. Previously, we had Reagan come in, and of course, he was a monster and everything else. But the big change, there's some mega changes. I compare this to the Roosevelt period. The U.S. was going through a Great Depression, and Roosevelt came in, and in 99 days, without Congress and opposing the Supreme Court, he shut down the banking system because they're failing, and transformed the entire structure of the American economy. Now, he was called by the leading editorial writer at the time completely unqualified to be president. He's a nice man, but he doesn't know what he's doing. He was also accused of becoming a dictator. And in the first 100 days that he did, he smashed the financial system deliberately, because he knew that, and in the process, he understood that the opposition would start forming against him in 100 days. His freedom for action would be stopped. The crisis was so deep that he had to do something. And so in those 100 days, he overrode Congress. He issued 99 presidential orders changing everything, and tried to stuff the Supreme Court with 2 additional people who were his favorites. So in a way, Donald Trump is the norm. He's not an abnormal figure. Figures like Lincoln, figures like Jackson were kind of not so much creating the situation, they're engineering the solution.
It's really interesting what you're saying, and I remember this quote where you said we shouldn't be surprised because it's happened in history. We just because maybe we didn't live it or perhaps we forgot or blocked it out, but we shouldn't be surprised by what we're seeing. I guess the question is, how does this play out with all this uncertainty, this chaos? People are waking up, they don't know what they're going to wake up to.
Well, the principle of these times, going back, is the United States reinvents itself. It is an invented country. There was no such thing as the United States. We invented it at the Constitutional Convention, and it reinvents itself periodically. Unlike other countries, it evolves, but evolves kind of operatically. You have these periods of tremendous instability as the old system is being dismantled. And then after the next presidential election, and it just happens to be presidential elections that trigger it, it reconstructs itself in a very different way. So the world after Roosevelt was very different than the world before Roosevelt, economically, politically, geopolitically, in every sense. So what happens is there's a period of deconstruction, presidency, which we're in now, as a storm. And then comes a period of, after Roosevelt, of tremendous prosperity and American power. Roosevelt was loathed at the time. People called him horrible things, okay, and thought him a monster. But he crafted himself into what he had to be. He's an incredibly rich man, incredibly rich, from an elite family, who actually portrayed himself as the champion of the poor. Now, I don't think he ever met a poor person in his life, but he knew how to craft himself for the times. And for the times, he was very obnoxious. Trump also does that. Now, Trump may be naturally obnoxious, but he also crafts himself, and that's what made him president. What everybody forgets when he says this is a fascist, he's a Nazi, and so on, he was elected democratically. He spoke to the times. Now, what were times we can talk about, but this is the way America reinvents itself. The old system becomes obsolete. It doesn't work. We kick it over. We build a new one. That's American.
George, you said we are in the storm right now. So have we seen the eye of it? Are we in the worst of part of it? Or do you think there's more?
There's plenty more storm coming. Again, after he transformed the banking system and wrecked the banking system, he created a massive federal government. In World War II, it became even more massive. And it was exactly what was needed at the time, federal control. The federal government, after 50 years, had become, in a way, obsolete. It had grown so vast that it was unable to function. So what Roosevelt built, Trump now has to redesign, re-engineer.
So what I'm hearing from you, so once this reset takes place, which let's say it's 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line.
Normally, it would be last out his presidency.
Okay.
50 years ago, it was a different president, and he did something very radical. He changed the tax code to something that favored the wealthy and undermined the poorer classes. He changed the tax code. It was called supply-side economics. And he built the investment capital that made Microsoft possible, made the tech boom possible. Without that transformation, investment capital wouldn't be available. And suddenly there were hedge funds all over the place pumping money into this. So what he did at the time seemed abominable, and he was dismissed as an actor who didn't know what he was doing and corrupt and what have you, and he was vilified. But he did a small thing, changing the tax code, that had a tremendous effect and created the next 50 years of technical evolution. Now, at this point, you're going to have, during the Reagan presidency, there was a tapering off toward the end of his actions. But now we're in a major reconstruction, the institutional reconstruction, the social reconstruction, the economic reconstruction. We also have, as a coincidence, a geopolitical crisis. Uh, the Ukrainian war, the failure of the Soviets, the Russians, I'm sorry, to show they couldn't overtake Ukraine in 3 years. They would invade Europe. This is crazy. They lost the war by not winning it. So now we have a conflation of crises, of the international crisis, the financial crisis in the United States, the social crisis in the United States, the culture wars that have been raging. And all of these things now need resolution. So the culture wars emerged from Roosevelt's empowerment of Black people, a desire to empower Black people, the integration of the 50s, and so on. And it reached a point of, if you call it reduction ad absurdum, we invented parallels of Black suppression, which is unique and horrible, where then women came, yes, they should be equal. Now sexual proclivities should be equal, and so on and so forth. So the rest of the country looked at what the norm was and were horrified. They had taken us far away from where we were. They looked at the economic system and said it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't very good. And they took a very close look at our institutions. And so they picked a man who was not particularly likable personally, but they said, okay, I like him a lot more than what we have. And he went about his business. He's going about his business.
You mentioned the financial model, and I'd like to just hone in on that a second because we even saw the greatest investor, Trevor Liv, Warren Buffett, now warning against the U.S. dollar um, and advising to look at outside of the dollar. What are your feelings when it comes to the supremacy of the U.S. dollar? Will it hold on to its reign, or do you feel that we're seeing a system reset here?
It's a very great system reset. The financial community is obsessed with money, and that's quite understandable. But this nation is more than money. It's national security. So we were in a posture toward the world where we were the anchor of the world along with the Soviets. And everybody knew there's one side or the other they were. They're pro-Russian, they're pro-American, the third side neutral. And it was a simple world. And the Americans behaved very responsibly, so did the Soviets. There was no war. Had it been the Germans and the French, God knows there'd be a war. Uh, so what happened to this system, however, was that the United States wound up for 50 years fighting wars everywhere. Not just starting with the South Korean War, but proxy wars with the Russians as we dueled in a distant sort of way with each other. And it was a period of constant, overwhelming intrusion in the rest of the world. And we crafted our financial system in terms of the Cold War. So first, we had to build an economic relationship with Europe that rebuilt Europe. Then we used tariffs and other things to give advantages to countries in the third world that we were struggling with the Russians. The Russians didn't have an economic hand. We used this as an economic hand. We also drew the Chinese away from the Russians. Remember, China's emergence depended on American imports and American investment. That was the foundation of the Chinese surge. So when we look at the financial system from the standpoint of an economist, it's a standalone system. When I look at it, it's one part of U.S. reality and policy. The financial system emerged out of World War II. The world was destroyed. Only the United States was viable. We took the responsibility of creating a trading system that allowed the world not to exploit the United States, but allowed the world to take American wealth and so on and so forth and rebuild itself. And now that period is over. The world is rebuilt. And the United States wants to disengage from the world. You look at our geography. We cannot be invaded by any country unless Canada really gets ticked off at us. But they're not going to invade us. The foundation of American grand strategy is command the seas. We got into World War II in World War I because German U-boats started attacking American shipping. We got into World War II because we were afraid the British fleet would fall in the hands of the Germans, the Royal Navy threatening the Atlantic. We had the same fear of the Russians. If they took Western Europe, then they'd hold the Atlantic ports. They could build a fleet. So what we did was we imposed at the borders where the Russians and Americans met a wall, and we stood guard on that wall. And behind that, we achieved economically what we wanted by favorable economic relations. We rebuilt Europe, and we did that in the other parts of the world as well. But at this point, Europe is rebuilt. The Russians have shown themselves not a threat. They couldn't take Ukraine. They're not going to take Western Europe. And so we are in a different world.
So are the BRICS not a threat, or are they, to the U.S. dollar?
They're cute little people. The U.S. dollar is an internal currency. If we can buy the products we need, that's fine. The idea that fluctuations in currency are a terrible outcome. The British pound lost its value and changed its value, and they survived. The idea that the U.S. dollar is the pivot of the global economy leaves us very vulnerable to the global economy. So it is not necessarily something that stabilizes the American economy.
Right.
It is something where we always have to look at not what is the optimal value of dollar internally, but how will it affect the Bulgarians? And the idea that there is a special place for the United States if the dollar remains dominant, and it will, because the American economy is dominant. The idea that being so vulnerable to international events is counter to American culture until World War I and this 100-year period since then, where so many Americans died and so much was given. Now we are saying, look, the world doesn't need us to be their baby. The dollar doesn't need to be the dominant currency. And if it is, it is, it isn't, it isn't. We have different needs now.
Hence your theory of moving towards this fortress America
Well, we are a fortress.
notion.
We are a fortress. We're drawn out of the fortress because the oceans were threatened. But the United States is a unique country. It occupies a continent. It's extremely wealthy. It's extremely creative. The idea that we are responsible for what happens in Bulgaria or what is the situation in South Africa or something. I mean, the idea of during the Vietnam War, the left wing condemned us as cops of the world. Well, here comes the man from the right who says, you're right. We're not the cops of the world. Let the world take care of itself. We'll take care of ourselves. And you have to look at that financial crisis in that context.
Okay, I just want you to further, because this is an important point about the dollar dominance. So are you saying that even if other countries no longer see the dollar as being dominant, the U.S. will say, that's okay with us? Like, I want to hone in on what you said there, that we have different
Until
needs
the
now.
dollar became dominant in 1945, we did
Yeah.
very well. We have a vast internal economy. And that economy is creative, inventive, powerful. And we were a net exporting country. In the 1890s, the United States produced 80% of the world's industrial products. Um, we had a massive boom in the early 20s. We were China. Then World War I happened. And after World War I, the Europeans could no longer buy the American products. And that was the trigger of the Great Depression. We could no longer export. And one of the things we discovered then is there's a great upside to exports. There's a great downside to them too. Wars. So economists see a frictionless world. Geopoliticians see a highly frictionable world.
And and perhaps also central banks, George. And I'd love to get your analysis of why there's a race to hoard gold by central banks.
Because
Why?
because when nobody knows what else to do, they grab gold. I mean, in normal economic crises, they return to the 17th century, and the idea that gold has more value. The value of an economy is what it produces, the wealth it produces in terms of products, and so on. Gold is an instrument of exchange. Dollar bills are backed by that economy. But at this point, there's also another dimension of this that we have to remember: the Arab oil embargo. And the Arab oil embargo, because of geopolitical reasons, not financial reasons, the Arabs cut off oil supplies to the United States, creating a massive crisis, an economic crisis of gargantuan proportions. We're very vulnerable to those cutoffs. Now we have China at lower prices entering our markets, and they're providing the components to our industry. If the Chinese chose to cut off that, or if the Chinese had an earthquake, or Chinese had COVID, or what have you, the supply of the materials with which we produce become unavailable. So if you think of the Arab oil embargo and think of a situation where China can no longer surge their products at a lower price, which is financially beneficial. But what if it can be done? Now, China is on a two-track road, simultaneously incredibly integrated with the American economy and threatening war.
Right?
So the Chinese, if they threaten war, let's take them seriously for the moment. It means that the American economy internally runs into a tremendous wall. We don't have access to it. So there's danger in international trade as well as wealth. The danger is what is disrupted. And then it causes great problems.
You're talking hot war, threatening a hot war?
Sure. We always have hot wars.
Uh, okay, but
They're normal.
on that point, what do you think of some experts who are saying that China needs war, wants a war? They
Which is,
need it to get out of the recession.
I don't believe that they do want it, but they appear to be wanting it. And when someone appears to be wanting it, and I interpret as they don't really mean it, a reasonable person says, how do you know you don't really mean it? So could we be dependent on the German economy supplying us the spare parts for our economy in the event of war?
Right.
War is not an unusual thing. It's not the black swan. We have been at war constantly throughout the past century. So when we take a look at the financial system, it's a subset of national interest. And there are two national interests, overwhelming. There are many national interests, but two. One is the security interest. One is the financial interest. And in both cases, there's a point where you become too over-dependent on one. Businesses get in that situation. They become too dependent on one customer. And it's the viability of that customer that defines them.
So if I were to ask you, if we were to see where the next hot war would emerge, where would you place your bets? Where do you see it?
I don't see a war coming from China. China is in a terrible, dangerous position. It's in the same position the United States was in the 1920s. It must export. Its entire economy is built on two things: export, like the Japanese did before, and foreign investment. These are the two the critical things. But the Chinese have a problem. They have internal problems because wealth in China is not spread equally. The peasants, who are the majority, are vastly poor, hardly have advanced beyond what they were 50 years ago, okay? The coastal regions, well, they look like Europe. They look wonderful. But people don't go to where they are, and there's tremendous unrest there. And there's unhappiness in China about their industry and how it's developing. So the Chinese problem is this: they must continue having access to the American economy, creating an American dependence on China's resources, China's imports to run our industries. You saw what happened to Microsoft and Apple when they couldn't get it. And then you consider, how stable is China? How stable is China with this peasantry and so on? So it's the same way. If you're in business and you have only one customer, he owns you. And the point is that we own the Chinese. We're their big customer in a certain way. But more than that, we don't want to do anything to the Chinese. But cutting dependence on Chinese imports, even at the cost of higher prices in the United States, when you compare that to the risk of an Arab oil embargo or a Chinese embargo, it's the lower risk. From my point of view, when I look at the financial community, they're enclosed and obsessed with their own dimension. When they look at the other dimension, what happens to free trade when wars break out? We only created free trades to recover from a war, not as a permanent solution. And one of the things that really you do if you're a country is you protect yourself from the possibility that your suppliers can no longer supply. And that's one of the dimensions that everybody's ignoring.
And on that note, just to kind of wrap this tariff part, I want to get back to it. We saw the news of India, striking a deal with the UK. So we're seeing alliances forming, countries looking, to your point, outside of the US, right? Getting more than one client, right? So how does this transform the global perspective now, George?
Well,
Because
India is
America's cornering itself and we're seeing all these alliances forming. What does this look like?
well, first, let's talk about the alliances. The European alliance is obsolete for two reasons. The first reason is Russia is incapable of invading the West. That's why it was formed. The second reason is the Europeans are quite capable of defending themselves. The Danish economy spends less than 2% of its GDP on defense. The Europeans are able to defend themselves. The question is, will their citizens become soldiers? In my family, we all became soldiers, and in most families in America, this is normal. Europe has a cultural problem we can't heal. But at this point, forcing Europe to reconsider who it is and stop holding our troops, hundreds of thousands, hostage over there. We don't need to defend them anymore. So it's an obsolete concept. The alliance systems always change. They always have. We have, in this world, particularly the beneficiaries of it, seen this is the norm that we must maintain. It's not relevant, it's obsolete. As for other countries, we're moving into a very close relationship with India, the United States. The United States has turned to India economically, geopolitically. India is now a power that is the fourth largest satellite producer. He runs more spy satellite based than the United States, China, and Russia. India is emerging as a major alternative. and we're taking that alternative. So the idea that geopolitics is a stable, frozen condition is the thing we have to overcome. So what is going to be emerging is Europe has to decide what it is. There's no such place as Europe is a continent. It is not a country. When you say, what do the Europeans think? Well, I assure you the French, the Germans, the Hungarians all think different things. They don't even speak the same language. Imagine the United States, each of the states having their own foreign policy. So Europe has to do some very hard work reinventing itself. And European culture doesn't reinvent easily. So that's one thing. But other countries are emerging. We helped China emerge. China emerged, reached an extreme reduction ad absurdum, as I call it, the point of, and now we're in India. And the Indians and the Chinese are hostile to each other, which is very nice. And the Russians and the Chinese are not very friendly to each other either. So a new balance of power is emerging in the world. But the idea that the United States must be the guarantor of both the world security and the world economy is an obsolete idea. The world is a very different place than we created in 1945 at Bretton Woods and all the other agreements.
On the point of Europe, do you think we will see a dismantling of of Europe, of no longer being part of this Eurozone, of
Well,
pretending that
the
we're
Eurozone is a geographical thing. The European Union is a joke. It has no foreign policy. It has no president. It has no leadership. It's an alliance of people who continually maneuver around to get better financial advantage. NATO is an obsolete organization. There is no European defense community on its side. Europe has to go through a fundamental crisis of what it is. Is it going to be these divided countries that led to World War I and World War II? Or is there going to be a united Europe, in which case there has to be an acceptance by Poles that there might be a French president? And how do they talk to each other? Europe is a crisis point, and they were brought together under an institution invented by the United States, NATO, not for the European benefit, but for the American benefit. We did not want the Russians on the Atlantic. So somehow they took this as the norm. This will always be the case. And what this president is doing is not just in the financial area, but in the question of NATO and things like that. Saying on the Ukrainian question, it's the European wars, not our problem, which is a radical violation of the norm, which he was elected to do. And so when you look at Europe, that's the big crisis point, not the United States. The crisis point is that Europe has to come to terms with World War II. It never had to face the realities of those World War I and World War II because the United States had enough and occupied and dealt with the Russians. Now they have to make their peace. And when you look at the forces that are emerging in Europe, very right-wing, nationalist, and when you take a look at the relations between, well, France called a summit. No one showed up. And so who's the leader of Europe? Who's the president of European? Who's the foreign minister of Europe? There's dozens of them. There are 44 countries in Europe. We need to stop thinking of Europe as an entity. It is a series of small countries all going in different directions.
I want to also just get in a question on Canada here, since I have a large chunk of my audience from Canada concerned. Concerned. I mean, I just came back. I was covering the election there, and folks are really worried about threats of becoming, the 51st state, or that if, of course, if the U.S. wanted to overtake Canada with military force, of course they could.
But we,
Uh, but
what,
now we see
what would we
if
do
they
with the
wanted to.
Canadians? For God's sakes.
Well, well, now we see this separatist movement not just in Quebec, but alive and thriving in Alberta, George.
Yes,
I guess the question is, yeah,
in Saskatchewan, they want to join the United States. They keep saying they want to be part of Texas. It's
So so
Canada is a
s
strange place for me.
so do you think that we would see some sort of union, like a European Union, which obviously isn't working, but between Canada and the
The
US?
Mexicans president proposed something that was very thing, a North American empire, if you will, a North
Right.
American fortress, she called it. Now, came from the Mexican president, not from the American. But there's a geopolitical reality. We are a North American fortress. Canada, the United States has the same, and Mexico have the same geopolitical realities. We have two oceans protecting us from the Eastern Hemisphere. We have common interests. Now, Trump has geopolitics is the way the world will be. Politics is the way you engineer that outcome. He has a strange engineering process. He first makes extreme demands. He first makes extreme actions, and then he bargains them down. So his approach to engineering is such as first, shake the world up, get them to understand this isn't going to go on. His second thing is to make outrageous demands. But you notice he's slowly stepping down from all of them. The first things they said to the Canadians, well, it's not going to be like that. And that's not going to be the issue. It's not Canada. But he did want to shock the Canadians into the idea, okay, you're an independent country, behave that way. Stop depending entirely on the United States for your national defense. Stop depending on the United States as the primary place you sell your things. The statement will make you part of us was actually meant to say, you are part of us. You want to be separate? Be separate. But don't simultaneously claim to be separate and be so deeply integrated into us. And if you're going to be so deeply integrated, it's just we have something to say. But he couldn't say that reasonably. That's not the way he speaks to the American people. That's not the way he does it. And it's a very effective way. He shocked Canada into reevaluating who it is. Now, what it decided to do was remain what it is, but it can't. It can't stay there. And the Mexicans are far more sophisticated than Canadians in this. The Mexicans understood, no, we can't send all of our poor people north. We really can't do it. It's a good idea, but it's not going to work. And it was the Mexican president that spoke of the North American fortress. And the Canadians didn't hear her. But uh, it's really important to understand that when the Canadians say we're an independent country, what do they mean by that? And if you want to be an independent country, we can be this is what independence looks like. The Canadians are going to have to work through their own problem. Their problem is they're so used to a certain relationship with the United States that they regard any shift as monstrous.
George, we touched on so much. I guess just to wrap here, because like I said, you are a geopolitical maven. You have accurately predicted so many things throughout history. You've said war is not a black swan. But if I were to ask you, I guess no one knows what a black swan, which black swan is coming because it wouldn't be a black swan, but something that you are really looking at as
Eu-
as
Europe,
a red flag.
Europe,
Europe.
you have these countries that have bad histories. When Germany and France talk, they talk as people who killed each other a generation ago. Europe has to come to terms with the fact that it's 44 countries speaking different languages that no one understands outside of their country, having histories of anger and mayhem with their neighbors, but that as a united Europe, truly united, even with the people you don't like, Hungary or whatever, uh, you can flourish. So what the Americans would like to see, I think, is a flourishing Europe. I mean, but the Europeans have to make some fundamental cultural shifts, and it's very hard for them to do it.
And if they don't?
And if they don't, this is the place I look for war. Asia and
Wow.
Europe. Because Europe has a history going back centuries of these small nation states going to war. A world war involving the United States, that's precisely what Trump wants to avoid. Let's pull back. Let's be less involved. Let's stay here. Let's have a North American fortress and be happy. But the idea that the Americans were so deeply involved in the world was counter to all American history and all American intentions. That we're returning to the norm is what no one gets. The norm was always that the Americans are on their own, trading happily with whoever it did, but having a massive domestic economy.
You just, I literally had shivers running down my spine when you spoke about Europe's fate if they don't change the course they're on. Let's hope for better times. George Friedman, you could read more from George, a lot from George, at geopoliticalfutures.com. George, is that where folks can find more of you?
Too much of me and much of many others.
Thank you, George. And thank you all for watching. We'll have more great content coming your way. So be sure to stay tuned to the Daniela Cambone Show here on ITM Trading and sign up at danielacambone.com. Thanks for watching. Hi, everyone. If you're starting to question the system and want to protect what you have earned, you will want to download our free Gold and Silver Protection Guide. It's a clear, easy to follow resource that explains why gold and silver have stood the test of time and how they can help you build real financial security even as the dollar weakens. You'll learn about which metals to consider and the plan that best suits your needs, not Wall Street's. So click the link or scan the QR code to get started today. You're not going to regret it.